Hello guys. Tonight, we're going somewhere different. Imagine waking up in ancient Greece. No bed, no pillows, just a thin mat on a dirt floor. Your morning shower involves scraping olive oil off your skin with a curved metal tool. And breakfast? Stale barley bread dunked in watered down wine. This wasn't hardship. This was daily life. Tonight, let me guide you through why you wouldn't last 24 hours in the world that gave us democracy and philosophy, yet couldn't manage basic comforts we take for granted. Imagine walking into your new home in ancient Greece. The first thing you'd probably notice or feel is the chill in the air. No central heating, no insulation, and no glass windows to keep out the cold or let in the light. Instead, the windows, tiny, high up, and often just small rectangular openings, were designed for one purpose: to keep intruders out. They did very little to ease the gloom of the interior. The walls themselves weren't much better. If you were lucky, they might be made of sun-dried mud bricks, which could crumble if you leaned against them too hard. If you weren't, they might be built with stones set in clay mortar, not exactly smooth to the touch. On a windy day, you'd feel every draft pushing through the cracks, carrying dust and dirt in with it. Inside, things didn't improve much. Most homes were designed around a central courtyard, which served as the focal point of family life. So unless you planted yourself outside in this little open-air space, you were spending your time in cramped rooms clustered around it. These spaces were simple to the point of being bare. One or two larger rooms might serve as the heart of the house, used for basic activities like eating or resting, and the others were tiny, functional spaces for storage or cooking. There was no such thing as a cozy living room, no plush sofas to sink into after a long day. Instead, you'd likely sit on a stool, a bench, or the hard ground. If you had anything resembling a chair, it was probably wooden and more decorative than comfortable. Privacy? Forget it. Families, often extended families, shared these tight quarters. That meant several generations living together in spaces with thin partitions at best, and no partitions at worst. You couldn't retreat to your bedroom at the end of the day, because bedrooms weren't really a thing. Sleeping arrangements were communal, and often involved laying out mats or blankets on the ground in whatever space was available. If a guest arrived, they might sleep in the same room as you, or even alongside you. Doors didn't lock, so there wasn't much separating you from people wandering in or out. Now, you might be thinking about how nice it must have been, stepping out into that courtyard. At least, there you'd get a bit of relief. And yes, the courtyard did provide natural light, but it came with its challenges too. Seasonal weather had no mercy on these open spaces. In the heat of summer, the sun would bear down relentlessly, and there were few sources of shade. In the wetter months, rain could turn the courtyard into a muddy mess. Imagine navigating your own home and having puddles form smack in the middle of your floor plan. And speaking of practical inconveniences, think about the smell. Without bathrooms or any kind of modern plumbing, waste disposal was, let's call it primitive. Most households relied on simple chamber pots, which had to be emptied by hand. If you lived in a wealthier area, a communal sewer system might carry some of the odor away to the city limits, but even then, the stench lingered. Hygiene was an afterthought, or perhaps more accurately, a luxury. Let's get to the furniture, or the lack of it. A bed in ancient Greece would probably horrify you. No mattresses, no memory foam, not even piles of thick blankets. Instead, you'd be lying on woven mats, straw if you were lucky, laid directly on the floor. Sheets of wool might cover them. but they were often itchy and thin. Wealthier citizens could stretch their budget to include some kind of raised platform, usually a simple wooden frame, or, in rare cases, a bronze bed. But the comfort level didn't increase exponentially. And the pillows, filled with straw or feathers, they were more for keeping your head elevated than offering softness. In the winter, people would pile on thin woolen blankets or animal skins for warmth, but the cold would still seep through. Even kitchens weren't much better. Cooking often happened in a small, poorly ventilated room, or just outside in the courtyard. Without chimneys, the smoke from cooking fires filled the air, clinging to every surface. The tools were basic: clay pots for boiling, iron spits for roasting, and stone mortars for grinding grains. There were no ovens to bake a warm loaf of bread or fancy gadgets to speed up the process. A single hearth fire served multiple purposes: cooking, heating, and in some cases, lighting. And let's clear up any illusions about luxury. Sure, wealthy Greeks might have a few decorative items like painted pottery or finely woven textiles, but the average citizen's home was stark. Basic clay cups, wooden spoons, and bronze utensils filled out their dining sets. Floors were typically made from packed dirt, which turned to mud if something spilled, or if the weather outside crept in. Rugs were rare and mostly found in wealthier homes or during ceremonial occasions. Most people made do with bare floors that they swept as best they could, with brooms made of twigs or reeds. The structure of Greek homes reflected the values of the time. They were spaces to shelter you from the elements, not places to relax or express personal style. Life wasn't about comfort. It was about functionality and adapting to the natural world. This might explain why even wealthier homes didn't have the kinds of extras you might expect. No interior decorations for the sake of aesthetics, no built-in storage, hardly any separation between functional spaces. And yet, despite these limitations, homes in ancient Greece were well suited to the demands of the era. The thick walls, though rough, helped keep out the worst of the summer heat. The central courtyards provided natural light and ventilation. The compact design helped foster stronger ties between family members, as everyone inevitably spent time together in the same small areas. However, for the average modern person, these advantages probably wouldn't outweigh the sheer lack of privacy or the discomfort of living in such minimalist conditions. If you're someone who cherishes a quiet corner of your house to retreat to, ancient Greece wasn't the place for you. Imagine having to share every waking moment with your family, day after day, under a roof that did little to block out the world, or even the weather. The absence of doors with proper locks meant your home was never entirely your own. A gust of wind could send dust swirling into every corner, and neighbors, friends, and even strangers could wander in without much warning. The idea of home, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. There was no emotional attachment to comfort, no sense of sanctuary. The home was just a hub for basic necessities: eating, sleeping, storing tools, and hosting occasional guests. Decorative touches were minimal, and any extra space was dedicated to practical functions like grinding grains or storing food supplies. It was so far removed from the idea of sprawling modern homes with multiple bedrooms, plush furniture, and climate-controlled air. It's safe to say your modern home sweet home would feel like a dream to someone living in ancient Greece. Imagine describing a dishwasher or a thermostat to them. They'd probably think you were talking about the tools of the gods themselves. But for the Greeks, homes weren't meant to pamper or inspire. They were simply places to live, strictly by necessity, nothing more. But as uncomfortable as those homes might have been, they weren't designed to break you. They were designed to suit the hard lives people lived. And speaking of hard lives, just wait until you hear about what came next. Because once you stepped out of that claustrophobic home, your daily routine didn't get any easier. It just got grittier. Good morning. In ancient Greece didn't mean rolling out of bed and heading straight for a steaming cup of coffee. It was more like trying not to trip over stray dirt clods on your way to fetch water from a public fountain. Running water. That was just a myth back then, unless you counted it literally running down from a hill where the fountains or wells were usually located. And this wasn't a quick errand. Picture lugging a heavy, awkward clay jar filled to the brim, its weight digging into your shoulders or hands as you stumbled all the way back home. That water wasn't just for drinking. It had to stretch for cooking, cleaning, and whatever passed for washing up. Let's talk about that washing up, because if you're imagining anything close to a shower, you'll be disappointed. Hygiene in ancient Greece was practical, though by modern standards, it might feel more like an elaborate chore. Olive oil was the star of this routine, but not for eating. It was slathered on your skin, probably still a bit sticky from yesterday's sweat and dirt. Sounds soothing? Maybe, until you were scrubbing it all back off with a strigil. For those unfamiliar, this was a curved bronze blade, kind of like a spatula, but with none of the charm, that you drag over your skin to scrape off the oil, along with any dirt, grime, or dead skin that had built up. Think of it as skipping soap and hot water altogether and relying on oil peeling. While it was functional, the process left a lot to be desired in terms of feeling truly clean. One source even described it as a spa day, but without the spa, the day, or any real effect. That pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? Bathing itself was less about privacy and more about practicality. Many people didn't even have access to private spaces for grooming. Instead, bathing sometimes took place at public facilities or fountains, where modesty wasn't exactly a priority. People gathered to wash communally, loudly, and without much concern for personal boundaries. That might sound horrifying if you're used to locks on bathroom doors, but here's the thing. Cleanliness in ancient Greece wasn't just a private matter, it was a social one. Bathing alone would have been seen as strange. You bathed where people could see you because hygiene itself was a public affair, not the solitude-filled ritual we know today. Cleaning clothes wasn't much easier. Laundry involved hauling those same heavy jars, of course, usually back and forth from a small water source, unless you lived near a river. Then you'd spend time scrubbing garments by hand, likely on the same rough stones where the town's other residents did the same. It was tedious, but necessary. And unlike today, there was no tossing clothes unnoticed into a machine before rushing out to do something else. Here, the effort for even basic fundamentals consumed large parts of the day. Even simple grooming tools were rudimentary. Fingernails might have been cleaned with a crude stick or another makeshift object, and hair care. Unless you were wealthy enough to afford ornate combs or personal grooming slaves, you were probably stuck with minimal options involving bone or wooden tools. Long hair was often kept tied back, not for pure style, but mostly because of practicality. If your morning routine today includes carefully styling your hair or picking out accessories, you might want to scale those expectations way back. There wasn't much luxury or time for ornamentation when your hands were already full, and we mean that literally, with the basics of survival. Then there was the ordeal of shaving. Men in ancient Greece, especially in the earlier periods, often didn't fuss much about having beards. Actually, facial hair was considered a sign of maturity, so shaving wasn't necessarily part of a daily routine for everyone. But if you were one of the fashionable few who aimed for a tidier appearance, the tools didn't help. Bronze or iron razors were as sharp as ancient metallurgical skills could make them, which is to say, not very sharp. The process was more of a strategic tugging and scraping situation, with about as much finesse as you can imagine. A slip could leave you with cuts, while the rusty edges didn't exactly scream clean shave. And let's not ignore the sheer time investment that these things demanded. Let's say you managed to wash yourself, scrape off the olive oil, pull your hair back, carry water, and maybe give your clothing a cursory rinse. This wasn't a 15-minute undertaking. And after all that effort, you'd move on to another simple task. Breakfast. But we'll get to that in just a moment. For now, let's focus on how everything about this start to the day was reactive rather than proactive. There was no grooming routine to achieve glowing skin or perfect hairstyles. The focus was completely on maintaining basic hygiene under difficult and time-consuming circumstances. It makes you think twice about hitting snooze on your alarm clock, doesn't it? Because every little action, fetching water, scraping oil, scrubbing clothes, required such relentless energy right from the start. But even though it sounds exhausting, these routines also reflect how Greeks adapted to limited resources and turned ordinary tasks into systems of survival. The olive oil, for instance, came from the surrounding land and doubled as a cleanser, moisturizer, and probably a layer of protection from the harsh sun. It wasn't a luxury item, it was a necessity. Public fountains ensured that water remained accessible to the community in the absence of indoor plumbing. Although accessible is relative when you still had to physically retrieve and transport it every single day. Then there's the sociability of it all. Today, we cherish closed bathroom doors and solitary prep time. But for the average Greek, getting themselves or their clothes cleaned often meant interacting with neighbors or strangers going about the same business. Whether for better or worse, there was little room for solitude or self-consciousness. Most mornings were less about pondering abstract thoughts at dawn, like philosophers did, and more about enduring the physical tasks that would set the tone for the grueling hours ahead. If you're hearing all this and thinking about how tired you'd feel before even starting your day, well, congratulations. You've just stumbled upon why morning routines in ancient Greece often left people drained. Forget pressing snooze or feeling hazy without a jolt of caffeine. Carrying clay jars of water, grappling with strigils, and dousing yourself in oil before breakfast probably made modern inconveniences, like your Wi-Fi not connecting, seem like paradise in comparison. But it wasn't only physical exhaustion that weighed on mornings. The overarching theme of life was scarcity, not just of comforts, but even of time. Every moment you weren't doing something essential risked falling behind in the race to survive. This communal, grueling, highly physical way of life created a natural rhythm, one based on necessity rather than choice. You didn't carry those water jars uphill for fun or scrape yourself raw with a bronze tool because it was good for the spirit. You did those things because there wasn't an alternative. So, you've carried water, scrubbed yourself down, and maybe even exchanged a few loud greetings with strangers. Congratulations, you've officially made it through what ancient Greeks considered getting ready for the day. Sounds fulfilling, right? Except now you're racing into dawn with an empty stomach, where the next adventure involves choking down a breakfast that might make modern processed granola bars feel like gourmet dining. But don't worry, we'll get to that. Imagine starting your morning with barley bread so dense and dry that even your teeth feel like they're putting in overtime. This wasn't a snack to enjoy, or even a meal to look forward to. It was fuel. The Greeks called it maza, and for most people, this rough, no-nonsense bread was what kicked off their day. Made from ground barley mixed with water, maza was shaped into small flat cakes and either baked on hot stones or in the ashes of a fire. The result? Something that achieved the impressive feat of being both tough and crumbly. You didn't have to be culinary expert to guess that it wasn't much fun to eat. To make things slightly more tolerable, you dunk the bread into watered-down wine. Before you jump to any fancy notions about this being an early version of wine pairings, let's clarify. It wasn't for flavor. Water in ancient Greece wasn't always safe to drink, and mixing it with wine acted as a kind of disinfectant, killing off some bacteria and making it a bit less risky to consume. Everyone drank it this way: farmers, parents, even kids. It was just part of life. So there you are, chewing on bread that could probably double as a brick, softening it slightly with diluted wine, and calling it breakfast. The purpose of such a meal wasn't indulgence or pleasure, it was survival. Modern breakfasts, with their fluffy pancakes, juicy fruits, and aromatic coffees, feel decadent compared to this ancient Greek reality. Eating in the morning wasn't about waking up and savoring food. It was about giving your body the absolute minimum it needed to tackle a physically demanding day. The word enjoy wouldn't have entered your mind. You didn't sit back with a fork and knife, because utensils weren't part of the deal either. Meals were eaten with hands, accompanied by plenty of crumbs, and, if you weren't paying attention, maybe a chipped tooth. For those hanging on to hope for variety, here's some bad news. There wasn't much. If you had access to anything beyond maza, it probably came in very limited quantities. A handful of figs, a few olives, or maybe a cutting of goat cheese might make an occasional appearance on the breakfast table, but only for wealthier families. Poorer Greeks didn't have the luxury of these extras. Their meals were repetitive, with barley bread forming the foundation of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Even those occasional additions of olives or cheese weren't as lavish as they sound. Forget glossy olive oil-soaked appetizers or creamy feta. These were simple, practical ingredients meant to tide you over, not to delight your palate. Compared to today's elaborate breakfast options, you'd notice a lot was missing. No eggs sizzling in a pan, no fresh orange juice poured into a glass. Even the simplicity of toast and butter would have seemed extravagant. And there was certainly no coffee. That morning jolt we rely on didn't exist. Instead, you relied on the slight kick from your watered-down wine, which, let's be honest, probably didn't leave you feeling particularly refreshed. But the real absence wasn't just in flavor, it was comfort. Meals weren't enjoyed while sitting at tables with cushioned chairs. People often ate wherever it was convenient, sitting cross-legged on the ground or perched on a stool. There were no cozy dining spaces. Eating was functional, quick, and far from leisurely. Breakfast wasn't a moment to gather around and bond with family. It was just a pit stop before the day's grind began. Now, if you were of the wealthier sort, your breakfast situation might have been marginally better, though not by much. Wealthier Greeks had access to better quality bread and might supplement their meal with honey or nuts, luxuries that poorer citizens couldn't even dream of. Honey, in particular, was cherished for its sweetness, but obtaining it was no small task. It required either beekeeping or trading. When it was available, it was used sparingly, drizzled onto bread or eaten by itself, making it a fleeting, rare delight in an otherwise dull diet. For those who could afford it, goat milk or goat cheese might accompany a morning meal. The cheese, often aged and salty, provided some protein and fat, giving the wealthier Greeks an edge in nutrition. These small additions might have been what kept wealthier bodies a few steps ahead of their poorer counterparts as they tackled their daily work. But even with these few advantages, breakfast was still a far cry from a luxurious affair. Comfort and options didn't climb very high on the priority list, even for those who could afford more. And then there's the texture of barley bread to consider. If you're picturing anything remotely resembling fluffy modern bread, adjust that image now. Barley is naturally dense and doesn't rise like wheat, so maza often resembled something between a flatbread and a cracker. It could be baked until it was brittle, which meant biting into it sometimes required more effort than eating should. Some accounts describe it as being so dry, it could crack a tooth when you bite it. Softening it in wine wasn't just about flavor. It was a survival tactic to save your jaw. This utilitarian breakfast reflects the Greeks' relationship with food as a whole. Meals weren't designed to impress. They were designed to sustain. Historically, barley had long been a staple crop, not because it was tasty, but because it was hardy. It grew well in the rocky, sun-scorched soil of Greece, making it a dependable choice in a region where survival often hinged on weather and crop yields. Barley bread wasn't an indulgence. It was a practical solution to an ongoing challenge. For the vast majority of people, breakfast came from what they could grow or trade locally. If a harvest went poorly or trade was interrupted, options became even more limited. Imagine eating nothing but barley day in and day out, knowing that if crops failed, even that might not be an option. That's why eating was, at its core, about necessity. It was about getting just enough energy to make it through another demanding day of farming, herding, or manual labor. Not much more. The contrast between modern breakfast and ancient Greek breakfast is almost laughable in its extremes. Today, breakfast can be an art form, an event we photograph and share with others. Ancient Greeks, if they could see a full brunch spread complete with pastries, eggs Benedict, fruits, and endless coffee refills, might have mistaken it for a feast fit for the gods. But in their world, the gods were probably better fed than most mortals. By the end of your ancient Greek breakfast, you wouldn't be feeling satisfied or energized. You'd just be ready to move on. And while we can joke about the monotony of it or wonder at the sheer toughness of those maza cakes, it's also a stark reminder of how food wasn't just a pleasure. It was survival. Eating wasn't about indulging cravings. It was about fueling your body for hard labor. Maybe you savored the occasional fig or a tiny drizzle of honey. But these moments were rare, not routine. After swallowing your last bite of barley bread and possibly shaking crumbs out of your lap, you might be tempted to linger, to catch your breath maybe. But there wasn't time for that. The demands of the day were already calling, and relaxation was a luxury that had no place in most people's lives. Breakfast wasn't a pause. It was a brief moment to prepare for what came next. And trust me, what came next wasn't going to offer much of a break either. Imagine waking up at the crack of dawn, knowing that every drop of daylight would be spent bent over, hauling, scraping, lifting, or digging. It didn't matter if your feet were blistered, if your back ached, or if the heat was already pressing down on your shoulders like an invisible weight. The day was waiting, and the work didn't care how you felt about it. For most ancient Greeks, this was life. From farmers scratching out an existence in rocky soils to craftsmen hunched over tiny workshops. Everyone's day started and ended with labor, because survival wasn't optional. Let's start with the farmers. These were the backbone of Greek society, and their labor was relentless. Picture walking barefoot over uneven, rocky fields as you guided a rudimentary wooden plow that was little more than a stick, pulled by oxen that were just as exhausted as you. Tools were basic: plows, sickles, hoes, and every one of them demanded more from your muscles than any machine ever could, because the tools couldn't work without you driving them. Every step meant navigating unforgiving land filled with stones and dry earth, the sun climbing higher with every hour. There was no relief from the elements. In the summer, the heat was merciless, burning your skin and drying sweat before it could even hit the ground. In colder months, icy winds tested your endurance, cutting through thin clothing with no thought about how much work still had to be done. Harvest season, that wasn't a celebration, it was chaos. You spent long hours cutting grain with sickles, bundling the stalks by hand, and carrying them back for threshing. Threshing itself was another test of endurance. The grain had to be separated from the stalk using flails or by letting animals stomp over it. Imagine kneeling in the dust for hours, your hands raw from the constant grip of rough tools. And after all that, there was grinding to be done. Women typically took on that task, using heavy grinding stones to turn barley or wheat into flour. It required strength and patience in equal measure, and yes, it was tedious. Craftsmen fared no better. You had blacksmiths, potters, carpenters, and stonecutters, all of whom worked in conditions that modern safety regulations would have a field day with. Blacksmiths, for example, had to carefully control a charcoal-fired forge, heating metal until it became pliable enough to shape. There were no welding machines or precise tools, just hammers, tongs, and a heap of skill. One wrong move with molten metal could cost you a limb or worse. Potters, meanwhile, spent their days bent over, shaping clay with their hands or feet, turning it on a simple wheel that demanded constant motion. Kilns required careful management to avoid cracking or ruining the finished pieces. And even then, results were far from guaranteed. Mistakes meant wasted time and valuable materials lost forever. And then the stonecutters. Now that was a profession that tested not only strength but stamina. Without jackhammers or powered saws, every block of marble was chiseled by hand. Days were spent crouching over half-shaped stones, chipping away piece by piece. The work wasn't just hard, it was punishing. These weren't small stones we're talking about either. In cities like Athens, the demand for stone fueled massive construction projects, temples, public spaces, theatres, all of which relied on human muscle. Injuries were common. Breaks were non-existent. Even if you weren't shaping cities or growing food, your body was part of the economy. Slaves, of course, bore the worst of it. Those working in fields or mines endured conditions that were unimaginably harsh. In silver mines, for example, men, women, and children labored in dark, claustrophobic tunnels. The air was thick with dust, suffocating and poisonous. These mines weren't just dangerous, they were deadly. Collapses were frequent, and the lack of ventilation exposed workers to toxic fumes that slowly strangled them over time. For farm slaves, the days were just as long, but had the added punishment of physical exposure. Their shelter was meager, their meals were sparse. For them, the concept of rest, freedom, or fairness didn't exist, because legally they were property. But even free citizens had little time for leisure. The idea of weekends or labor laws was as foreign to the Greeks as indoor plumbing. You worked until the job was done, or until you couldn't physically continue. Where modern laws cap workdays and ensure breaks, ancient Greek life enforced no such limits. If you were a farmer, you worked until the harvest was complete, because letting crops spoil wasn't an option. If you were a craftsman, you met the demands of your clients or risked losing what little income you earned. And that brings us to another point. This wasn't a world overflowing with wealth. For most, daily work wasn't about building a comfortable life. It was about preventing starvation. There was no such thing as work-life balance. Work was life. Rest was brief, taken only late at night, or when your body gave out and you couldn't go further. Even the idea of stopping for lunch looked very different. Meals were quick, often eaten alone or on the move. You might gnaw on some dried figs or bread while crouched in the field or sitting by your tools. There was nothing leisurely or refreshing about it. The goal was simply to refuel and keep going. And if you think the outdoors offered most of these hardships, let's talk about household labor. Greek women led their own version of relentless work within the home. Their days started early, often fetching water, a back-breaking task of hauling heavy jars from public fountains back to the household. Once that was done, there were clothes to weave, thread to spin, and grain to grind. Weaving, in particular, wasn't a hobby. It was a central part of maintaining a household. Every garment, every sheet of linen, every coverlet required hours upon hours of weaving on a loom, a task that demanded patience, dexterity, and concentration. Cooking wasn't much easier. Preparing meals meant more grinding, chopping, and boiling, without the convenience of timers, thermometers, or modern ovens. Every step took longer, and the physical exertion was constant. Tasks like picking olives or pressing them into oil were seasonal but no less demanding, and these duties often fell to women as well. Children weren't spared from all this either. From a young age, they were included in chores, fetching water, helping with meals, and learning the endless rhythm of labor that defined Greek life. Weather added another layer of difficulty. Farmers braved the scorching summer heat or freezing winter winds. Craftsmen worked in cramped spaces, often without much ventilation, breathing in smoke or dust. There were no days off for inclement weather. Rain wasn't an excuse to avoid the plow or the grinding stone. Shelter offered little protection from those extremes, so the conditions of your work carried over into the conditions of your rest. To call this life hard is an understatement. It's not just the absence of modern tools, it's the lack of any reprieve. Every day was a cycle of physical strain, repeated endlessly until your body finally gave out. Life expectancy reflected this reality. Sure, there were plenty of factors influencing the low average: disease, nutrition, accidents. But the daily grind shaved years off lives. The physical toll was inescapable. And for many, the idea of living much past your 30s simply didn't happen. But here's the thing. This back-breaking labor fueled an entire civilization. The temples, the theaters, the city walls, the very symbols of Greek culture, were built on the sweat and sacrifice of ordinary people. The communities functioned not because of grand philosophers or mythical heroes, but because people fought through the daily grind, even when it left their bodies broken and spirits drained. If you've ever complained about a slow internet connection or a long workday at your desk, take a moment to imagine chiseling marble by hand, under the glaring sun, or grinding grain for hours just to bake a loaf of bread. For most ancient Greeks, the idea of free time or comfort would have been the stuff of dreams, or maybe an indulgence best left to the gods. While the men labored in sun-scorched fields or smoke-filled workshops, The women toiled endlessly indoors, weaving, grinding, and managing households under relentless demands. Even children were part of the equation, thrust into labor as soon as they could hold a tool. Everyone contributed because no one could afford not to. And for most, a day off was as mythical as Pegasus. As the sun finally sank below the horizon, the work didn't feel fulfilling. It just felt done, at least for one more day. But don't get too comfortable. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin all over again. Because in ancient Greece, life itself was the hardest job of all. Imagine waking up, not to the possibilities of a new day, but to the same narrow life you've lived every day before. Your world revolves around a handful of rooms, none of which belong entirely to you, and a strict set of duties determined before you were even born. In ancient Greece, especially in Athens, if you were a woman, this was your reality. Your day started early, before the sunrise, and not because you had ambitions to chase. The loom waited for you, the grain needed grinding, the household depended on you to juggle all of it. By the time the sun came up, you were already exhausted. Life for women, particularly in Athens, was confined, almost claustrophobic in its limits. You were expected to stay at home, spinning wool, weaving fabric, raising children, and managing the household. Those spinning and weaving routines weren't just hobbies or occasional tasks. They were constant, requiring hours upon hours of meticulous attention. Every thread, pulled taut on the loom, symbolized your role in society, restrained, repetitive, and invisible outside the household walls. Managing the grain was no better. Grinding it into flour was back-breaking, hand-heavy labor that took significant chunks out of your day before you even got to cooking the bread. And if the water jugs were empty, that was also on you. Hauling them back from a public fountain wasn't exactly a morning stroll. It was a trip laden with weight, physically and figuratively. And stepping outside, not so simple. Women were largely expected to stay at home, venturing into public spaces only when truly necessary, and often accompanied by a male relative or escort. Culturally, a woman's virtue was tied to her visibility. The less the public saw of her, the better. Walking alone in the streets of Athens would have been unthinkable and, frankly, dangerous. Public spaces like debates, gymnasiums, and even theatres were predominantly male domains, with women expected to remain on the sidelines, or more often, stuck behind literal closed doors. But the isolation didn't stop there. Even within the home, women were physically and socially separated from the central areas where men conducted business or entertained guests. Instead, most of their time was spent in the gyneceum, the designated women's quarters. Picture a room tucked away in the house, simple and sparsely furnished, a work area more than a sanctuary. From those quarters, women could hear the male-driven life happening in the larger parts of the home, yet they weren't allowed to participate. Outside of interacting with other women of the household, or possibly slaves, their social exchanges were rare and limited. It wasn't unusual for women to see the world beyond their latticework windows rather than stepping into it. While men philosophized, made laws, or attended public events, women wove and baked and cleaned, unseen. Education? Don't get your hopes up. For most Athenian women, their schooling began and ended in the home. A handful might have learned basic literacy to read or manage household accounts, but philosophy, mathematics, and rhetoric were out of the question. These subjects were reserved for boys. Women received training instead in domestic skills, how to manage a kitchen, how to weave finely, how to raise children. Their futures depended far more on mastering these soft skills than any academic knowledge. Ask a young Athenian girl what she wanted to do with her life, and the answer wasn't hers to decide. Her role had already been mapped out. Marry, bear sons, stay out of sight. And marriage wasn't a romantic choice back then. It was an arrangement. Fathers negotiated these unions, often marrying their daughters off in their early teens to much older men, further cementing the imbalance of power. Now let's contrast this with Sparta, often remembered as the outlier. Spartan women did have more freedom compared to their Athenian counterparts. They weren't confined to gymnasiums or barred from public life. They exercised publicly, could inherit property, and even received education. But before you imagine ancient Spartan life as feminist paradise, understand the reasoning. These freedoms were tied directly to the state's obsession with its military. Spartan women were granted their relative autonomy because it served a purpose. They were tasked with producing and raising strong warriors. Their education wasn't for personal growth. It was to make them better caretakers of the future soldiers Sparta depended on. Their physical exercise wasn't about enjoyment or independence. It was designed to prepare their bodies for childbirth. The expectation was clear: bear strong sons or face disgrace. If Spartan husbands died in war, a not uncommon occurrence, the property didn't automatically grant women newfound independence. They had limited inheritance rights, and even their ability to remarry required permission under certain circumstances. For all their comparative freedoms, Spartan women were still locked into societal roles shaped by war and the demands of the state. If Athenian women lived invisible lives behind household walls, Spartan women were visible, but just as controlled. It's almost ironic, considering Athens is celebrated as the birthplace of democracy. But its version of democracy came with exclusions. Women, much like slaves and foreigners, weren't part of the famed democratic process. To vote or participate in assemblies like the ecclesia, you had to be a male citizen, born to Athenian parents. Women, children, and all others, roughly 90% of the population, weren't given a say. Athenian democracy, for all its intellectual glory, flat out ignored women as a political force. They lived in a world where decisions were made about society, education, and even their own lives by a room filled entirely with men. Modern ideas of inclusion and equal representation would have been unimaginable to them. The more you look at everyday patterns, the clearer the constraints become. Even something as central as family didn't provide women with autonomy. They raised children, certainly, but the sons they bore belonged to society more than to their mothers. Sons were groomed to become citizens, future soldiers, participants in public life. All roles that excluded the women who gave them life. Daughters were simply prepared for the same limited futures that their mothers had endured. So was there any room for individuality or personal ambition? Not really. The lives of Athenian women were guided by strict social norms, upheld and enforced not just by men, but by other women as well. Straying from expectations wasn't just frowned upon. It could lead to social exclusion or worse. Even wealthier women, who had the benefit of slaves to shoulder some of the manual labor, didn't escape the boundaries set by Greek society. A larger home, finer clothing, and better food didn't change the core reality. Their lives served a household function rather than an individual one. We often look at these restrictions with modern eyes, marveling at how different ancient norms were. But for Athenian women, this was everyday life, expected, entrenched, and enforced. The idea of challenging the system wasn't just unthinkable, it could be dangerous. The women of ancient Athens weren't just kept out of the public eye. They were, in many ways, kept out of the culture altogether. Perhaps the starkest difference is that modern women, in many parts of the world, now have choices that cut across areas once locked behind heavy doors. Education, careers, political participation, and autonomy are things we often take for granted, but were entirely off the table for most of Greek history's daughters. That said, Sparta shows us that even when women had more liberties, those freedoms existed not for their sake, but to serve a specific societal function. So whether you were weaving in Athens or exercising in Sparta, your life as a woman still held one unbending commonality. You existed to reinforce the order of the world around you. And in a society obsessed with structure, harmony, and the gods themselves, there was little room for questioning where you fit within it all. The world of ancient Greece didn't just limit women's roles, it confined their very identities. Every decision about what you could and couldn't do was defined by your gender and enforced by tradition. Even behind the grandeur of temples and the brilliance of philosophical thought, the simplicity of the system revealed its darker side. Women were essential to the survival of Greek society, but almost entirely erased from its story. Meanwhile, as women remained in the shadows of daily life, the men of ancient Greece had their own expectations to face, including the harsh, often brutal reality of military life. Imagine this: you're 7 years old, and already someone has decided the course of your entire life. Almost every comfort you've known, your family, your home, even the softness of a full belly, has been stripped away. In their place, grueling physical training, cold rations, and constant punishment designed to toughen you up. This wasn't unique to just a handful of boys. In Sparta, it was the beginning of a government-run military training system called the agoge. Here, the goal wasn't to nurture children. It was to craft warriors who could endure pain, hunger, and fear without flinching. For the Spartans, war wasn't just a part of life. It was life. From the moment a boy entered the agoge, every aspect of his existence became a test. Physical endurance was the baseline, and failure wasn't an option. Starvation, that wasn't a sign of neglect. It was a teaching tool. Spartan boys were deliberately underfed to push them into scavenging or stealing food. And if they got caught stealing, it wasn't the theft that got punished. It was the failure to be sneaky about it. The agoge drilled the idea that clever disobedience was better than clumsy submission. It wasn't just about making you strong somewhere in your teens. It was about survival skills for the battlefield, the streets, or anywhere survival might demand ruthless cunning. And if you thought basic survival in Spartan training was bad, imagine the discipline. Whippings weren't just a punishment. They were a regular occurrence, almost ritualistic. Boys were beaten to build their ability to endure pain silently, sometimes in full view of audiences. The Spartan discipline was relentless. It aimed to strip away not only weakness, but individuality. Being a Spartan warrior wasn't about you. It was about the collective, the state. Personal comfort, preferences, and even basic choices were all luxuries these boys were taught to live without. The boys trained almost constantly. This wasn't just jogging laps or doing push-ups. You were expected to practice hand-to-hand combat, endure long marches weighed down with armor, and constantly keep your weapon skills sharp. There were no days off, no moments of rest to let your bruises heal. A Spartan didn't just fight when necessary. He lived in preparation for war. And if a boy proved too weak to make it through the agoge, let's just say the Spartans weren't known for their gentleness when it came to weeding out those deemed unfit for service. But the harsh training of the Spartans wasn't the only grind. In Athens and other Greek city-states, the path to military readiness looked a little different, but was still relentless. Male citizens were expected to serve, and while they wouldn't endure the same institutional indoctrination as Spartan boys, they were hardly spared from the physical demands. At age 18, Athenian men entered into military training that lasted 2 years. During this time, they learned to fight, to navigate the rudimentary strategies of battle, and to work together in tight formations. Once trained, they remained on call for decades. War wasn't an isolated event. It was a constant part of life. The rivalries between Greek city-states and threats from foreign powers like Persia kept the need for soldiers high and their lives uncertain. The battles themselves were brutal in their simplicity. Greek soldiers, known as hoplites, fought in compact formations called phalanxes. Imagine standing shoulder to shoulder with other men, forming an impenetrable wall of shields and spears. It sounds efficient on paper, but in the chaos of combat, the rank and file formations quickly turned into carnage. Your shield wasn't just for you. It protected the man next to you, and his shield protected you. If someone fell, the gap in the line put everyone at risk. The success of the battle all came down to unity, but the cost of failure, you didn't want to find out. The life of a hoplite was expensive too. Soldiers were expected to supply their own equipment. Bronze helmets, breastplates, greaves, shields, and spears weren't handed to them by the state. It meant paying for the tools of your survival out of pocket. If you were wealthy, you could afford top-notch gear. But for poorer men, skimping on armor might mean showing up to battle under-equipped. More armor protected your life, but also slowed you down during long marches. War wasn't just physically demanding, it was a financial burden too. And the marching. Hours and hours of it, across harsh terrain that offered little more than blistered feet and grit between your teeth. Food was minimal, often little more than dried rations stuffed into a pouch. Lack of rest was standard, especially during campaigns where urgency mattered more than the comforts of sleep. Between your armor, your weaponry, and whatever supplies you carried, you could be hauling upwards of 50 pounds on your back at any given moment. Now imagine doing that for miles, possibly uphill, in an unforgiving sun. By the time an actual battle began, you were already drained. The injuries sustained in combat were another level of suffering. A spear through the thigh, a broken shield arm after a hard blow. These weren't things you recovered from easily, if at all, and there were no medics waiting to patch you up in the field. If you got dragged back to camp, your fellow soldiers might try to pull you through, but the larger wounds often meant infection or death. Amputations without anesthesia weren't rare, and without antibiotics, a simple injury could easily become the end of a soldier's life. But it wasn't just physical suffering. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine surviving battle after battle, watching friends and brothers fall beside you, knowing you could be next at any moment. There was no respite once the fighting was done. There wasn't therapy to help you process the horror. No veterans' benefits waiting to thank you for your service. At best, the recognition might come in the form of a simple gravestone carved by someone who didn't even know you. That's if you were lucky enough to be buried at all. Even returning home wasn't a clean slate. For Athenian men, civilian life could pull you away from war, but the readiness to fight never truly left. If conflict arose, and it often did, you were expected to pick up your spear again and march back into the fray. If you had a family, they lived with the constant fear of your absence, and if you died, Well, they bore the financial and emotional weight of your loss. The line between soldier and civilian was blurry at best. Spartan men, on the other hand, never faced that confusion. Their lives were war, full stop. And then there were the naval exercises. Athens, with its impressive fleet, put much of its focus on maritime power. If you weren't marching or fighting on land, you might be rowing, hours of pulling heavy oars through rough waters. Warships, known as triremes, relied on human power for speed and maneuverability. That meant dozens of men rowing in perfect unison, with little chance to sit back or rest. Your arms ached, your back burned, and your hands blistered, but you kept going because stopping meant letting your ship fall behind, or worse, sinking. The culture surrounding military service added another layer of pressure. For men, serving wasn't just a duty, it was a defining aspect of their masculinity and worth. The inability or unwillingness to fight brought stigma and shame, isolating those who could not contribute. Sparta was even harsher on this front, ostracizing those who failed to meet their military ideals. In citizen soldier societies, your identity wasn't just tied to your family or trade. It was tied to your ability to pick up a weapon and stand in line. The absence of modern support systems made this life even harder. Today, veterans often have access to healthcare, therapy, and financial aid, however imperfect those systems may be. For ancient Greek soldiers, your reward for military service was not dying. There were no pensions, no recognition parades, no safety nets. Any psychological scars you carried stayed with you, quietly eating away as you returned to life in a world that expected you to be fine, to keep moving, to forget. In the end, military service in ancient Greece demanded everything: your time, your body, your mind. It wasn't something you did for a few years before retiring into peace. For many men, it was their beginning, their middle, and whether they fell on the field or survived long enough to grow old, their end. War shaped every corner of life in ancient Greece, leaving no room for rest, for comfort, or for the fragile hope of living without it. If you think work was hard or breakfast bleak, imagine doing it all while strapped inside a bronze chest plate, spear in hand, watching the horizon for a fight that could arrive at any moment. And as grueling as military life was, if war or hard labor didn't finish you off, there was still another looming threat to conquer: the dangerous, often fatal realities of ancient healthcare. Imagine spiking a fever and being handed garlic paste, told to smear it on your body and pray to a god who may or may not be listening. That was ancient Greek healthcare in a nutshell. A mix of kitchen ingredients, guesswork, and hope. There were no doctors as we know them today. No hospitals with rows of sterile beds. If you fell ill, you stayed home, surrounded by the remedies your family had on hand, and maybe some advice from the local healer. A person who was equal parts herbalist, philosopher, and gambler. Every treatment came down to rolling the dice. Greek medical understanding hinged on a belief in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If your humours were balanced, you were in good health. If they weren't, well, your physician would try to nudge them back into alignment. Let's say you were melancholic, which meant you supposedly had too much black bile. The treatment might involve dietary changes or purging, which sounds clinical until you picture it. You sitting there while someone forces you to vomit or bleed, all so they could balance something no one had ever seen. Doctors operated on these theories for centuries because, well, there wasn't much else to go on. But let's step back for a moment. before you even made it to a doctor, or whoever you considered a doctor at the time, you probably relied on basic home remedies. Garlic was a favorite go-to. Crushed, boiled, smeared or sipped, it was hailed as a cure-all for everything from infections to stomach issues. Another classic, boiled cabbage water. You drink it as a tonic, and if the taste didn't knock you out, maybe the placebo effect helped you feel better. Olive oil and honey were staples too, valued not just for cooking, but for their supposed healing properties. Honey was used as a wound dressing. Sticky, sure, but its natural antibacterial properties probably saved more lives than the Greeks realized. Still, it was more about accident than intention. Science wasn't driving these practices, luck was. And if the garlic paste and cabbage water didn't work, that's when you turned to the gods. The Greeks believed illness was often a punishment, a signal from the divine that you'd misstepped somewhere along the way. Healing sanctuaries, called Asclepia, sprang up to bridge the gap between suffering and salvation. These weren't just sterile temples with priests reciting chants. They were full-scale spiritual retreats dedicated to Asclepius, the god of healing. Getting better involved elaborate rituals, purification with baths, a specially prescribed diet, exercise programs, and a healthy dose of prayer. At night, patients slept in sacred dormitories, hoping to receive dreams that would reveal the cure, or at least convince them they'd been healed. If modern medicine seems slow, imagine waiting on a cryptic dream from a mythical god. But let's say you needed something more hands-on. Surgery was a gamble, and not one you'd take lightly. There was no anesthesia, no antiseptics. If you so much as nicked yourself on a rusting blade, your odds of survival dropped drastically. Surgery really only happened when death seemed like the only other outcome. A physician might lance a boil, set a broken bone, or extract an embedded arrowhead. But without sterilization or antibiotics, infection was practically guaranteed. The operating room was more of a last-ditch effort workshop, and the tools were crude. Bronze scalpels, bone saws, and hooks that probably looked more comfortable in a butcher's hands than a doctor's. The pain was unimaginable, but the alternative was usually worse. Infections from untreated injuries were common and often fatal. A simple scratch, left uncleaned, could become septic, and no one really understood why. Fever, swelling, and redness were signs of imbalance, but the underlying cause remained a mystery. It's why so many treatments focused on external signs rather than internal problems. Bleeding a patient to relieve fever, for example, might seem absurd now, but it was logical to a society centered on humors. If the blood was bad, you just removed some and hoped for the best. Spoiler alert, it rarely worked. Even childbirth, something that should feel like a natural, if taxing process, was filled with danger. Midwives handled deliveries, relying on years of experience passed down through generations, but there was only so much they could do. Complications like breech births or prolonged labor were often fatal for the mother, the child, or both. Without tools, medications, or sterile techniques, these deaths were devastatingly common. For women, childbirth was as much a risk as it was a rite of passage. The fragility of life permeated every stage. Life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years, but that number paints a partial picture. If you survived infancy, and 1/3 of children didn't, you still faced a gauntlet of threats: poor nutrition, unsanitary conditions, disease outbreaks and injuries. Communal sewers and fountains, while an improvement on no infrastructure at all, made cities like Athens a breeding ground for illness. The plague of Athens, which struck during the Peloponnesian War, wiped out almost 1/3 of the city. Crowded living conditions and lack of understanding about infection fueled the devastation. Disease didn't discriminate between classes. Wealthier citizens might have had better diets or access to traveling doctors, but plague struck everyone. And war added another layer to the problem. Injuries on the battlefield weren't just life-threatening because of the immediate harm. The filthy conditions of war zones, filled with mud, blood, and human waste, meant wounds could go septic almost instantly. Soldiers who survived battle often succumbed to diseases they picked up in the aftermath. It's no exaggeration to say that war killed as many through illness as it did through violence. The Greeks, of course, didn't have antibiotics or vaccines. Smallpox, typhus, and other diseases swept through populations unchecked. Even smaller-scale outbreaks of food poisoning or water contamination could decimate households. Drinking the wrong cup of water might be all it took to bring on a case of dysentery, a condition as miserable as it was common. Think about how we treat these illnesses now. Modern medicine can usually clear up a bacterial infection with a quick round of antibiotics. But without such knowledge, ancient Greeks were left to fight infections with garlic, sacrifice, and optimism. Still, for all the shortcomings, there were moments of brilliance. The Hippocratic Oath, one of history's earliest attempts at medical ethics, came from ancient Greece. It emphasized the idea of doing no harm, guiding physicians to treat the whole person, not just the disease. Hippocrates himself advocated for careful observation, understanding environmental factors like climate and water quality, and taking detailed patient histories. These were revolutionary concepts in their time, laying the foundation for modern medicine. And while the theory of humors didn't hold up scientifically, the emphasis on diagnosing imbalances, looking for patterns of excess or deficiency, helped foster a structured approach to treatment. But we can't ignore how often medicine intersected with religion, philosophy, and sheer guesswork. Even the best Greek doctors operated in an era where much of the human body was a mystery. Without dissection, internal anatomy was largely misunderstood, leading to treatments that addressed symptoms but rarely tackled root causes. Still, the Greeks did the best they could with the tools they had. It wasn't much, but considering the limitations of their era, maybe that's the most anyone could expect. For the average person, however, illness was less about treatments and breakthroughs and more about luck. You might survive with the right poultice, or a healer's well-timed insight. Or, just as easily, you might not. You could die from anything. A scratch that turned septic, a fever no one could explain, childbirth, or even something as simple as drinking tainted water. The gods didn't play fair, and neither did mortality. If you had the stomach for it, you hoped the prayers or rituals would tip the odds in your favor. If not, you might find yourself on the temple floor, hoping for that healing dream from Asclepius, all the while fearing the awakening might not come. And this fragility bled into every part of Greek society. The knowledge that survival was precarious shaped their art, their religion, their philosophy. It's why the Greeks endlessly pursued reason, wrestled with fate, and sought beauty in fleeting moments. Life wasn't guaranteed. They knew this better than most. And yet, they pressed on. They dreamed. They built. They tried to understand. But even with those aspirations, the reality was stark. Surviving illness in ancient Greece was a roll of dice weighted against you. And while disease and injury silently claimed many lives, an entire segment of society worked tirelessly and often invisibly to keep things running. Let's talk about them next. Imagine living in a society where nearly every household depended on the work of people who had no freedom, no rights, and almost no chance to escape their circumstances. That was life in ancient Greece. Slavery wasn't just a feature of society, it was its foundation. It didn't just happen in the darkest corners of the cities, it happened right in plain view, woven into every aspect of daily life. For most Greeks, slavery was as natural as the sun rising or the olive press running. The very idea that a society could exist without it wasn't even a question. They couldn't imagine it any other way. Ancient Greek slaves came from all walks of life. They weren't all from one race, ethnicity, or geographic region. Most were prisoners taken during wars, people captured by pirates, or even kidnapped individuals from distant lands. In some cases, people sold themselves or their family members into slavery during desperate times, trading their freedom for basic survival. And slavery wasn't restricted to the massive estates of the wealthy. Even modest households typically had at least one slave, often more. A family's prosperity, no matter how small, almost always involved someone else's suffering silently in the background. In Athens, slaves were essential to nearly every aspect of daily life. Many served in households, tackling every task imaginable. They cooked meals over smoky hearths, carried water from public fountains, cleaned floors, tended to livestock, and even cared for their owners' children. If you picture an Athenian citizen relaxing at home, debating philosophy or politics over a meal, there's likely a slave standing quietly nearby, ready to refill his wine or fetch whatever he might need. And some of those same slaves probably prepared the food and carried it on their backs from the market in the first place. Their labor kept homes functioning, while the masters of the house were free to enjoy lives of intellectual reflection, political involvement, or leisure. Picture it. Lofty conversations about justice or virtue, made possible by someone else scrubbing pots out of sight. But not all slaves worked in homes. Many were laborers, grinding away in far harsher conditions. Agricultural slaves spent long days plowing fields and harvesting crops, often under heavy supervision, with little to no rest. And then there were the ones who worked in the silver mines, like those in Lorion, a major source of wealth for Athens. If you imagine modern mining as dangerous, you wouldn't last a minute in these ancient conditions. Slaves were sent deep into narrow, poorly ventilated shafts, where they inhaled toxic dust and worked by the dim glow of oil lamps, if they were lucky enough to get them. The air was thick, the tunnels cramped, and the tools basic. For many, the mines became their tombs. It wasn't a job, it was a death sentence stretched out over weeks or months. Even for those in less extreme forms of labor, life as a slave in ancient Greece was harsh. Slaves were property, no different from livestock or tools. Whatever value they had wasn't tied to their humanity, but to what they could do. A skilled slave, like one who was literate or good with numbers, might be trained to manage accounts or serve as a clerk for their master's business. Some even worked as teachers or scribes. But make no mistake, no matter how educated or skilled, they were still slaves. Their talents might have earned them better treatment or kept them from manual labor, but they remained someone else's possession. If their owner wanted to sell them, punish them, or even kill them, no one could stop it. There were no laws protecting slaves from abuse, no courts where they could plead their case. Some slaves did manage to earn or buy their freedom, becoming what was known as freedmen. But even freedom came with strings attached. A freed slave didn't become a full citizen. They couldn't vote, own land, or participate in many areas of public life. and they were still bound to their former masters in one way or another. The system had built-in limits to make sure even freedmen couldn't climb too far, keeping them locked on the edges of society. What's perhaps most striking about Greek slavery is how deeply entrenched it was, not just in practice, but in thought. Philosophers, the very people we hold up as the pioneers of rational thinking, defended slavery as a necessity of life. Aristotle, for example, rationalized it by claiming that some people were natural slaves, meant to serve because they lacked the capacity for independence. It's chilling to consider how easily even the brightest minds of the time justified and reinforced a system built on exploitation. It wasn't seen as cruel or strange. It was normal. Without slavery, though, Greek society would have looked very different. Entire economies relied on the labor of enslaved people. Agriculture, construction, mining, and domestic life all depended on their work. Cities like Athens thrived on systems that could only function thanks to the effort of countless slaves who received no share of the wealth they helped produce. The splendor of Athens, its grand temples, its bustling markets, its celebrated schools of thought, was built, quite literally, on their backs. And yet, for all this dependence, slaves were rarely acknowledged in recorded history beyond their practical use. They lived their lives in silence, invisible to the legacy of ancient Greece. We remember the achievements of philosophers, generals, architects, and dramatists, but the people who actually built the city walls, carried the supplies, or harvested the grain remain nameless. The irony is breathtaking. A society celebrated for democracy, art, and philosophy sustained itself by denying basic humanity to a significant portion of its population. Even comparing their system to later historical examples like the transatlantic slave trade, ancient Greek slavery feels just as morally indefensible. Race didn't play a role in Greek slavery as it did in later systems. Slaves were taken from wherever they could be captured or purchased, but the absence of racial bias doesn't soften the cruelty. Whether the enslaved were Thracians, Scythians, Syrians, or other Greeks captured in war, their fates were defined entirely by a system that respected neither their lives nor their dignity. The violence wasn't always as visible as the mines or the lash of a whip, but it was woven into the everyday. A child born into slavery didn't grow up with dreams for the future. They grew up knowing they were someone else's property. Slaves weren't people who had jobs. They were the job, reduced to their utility. Their culture, languages, traditions, and aspirations were erased by ownership, replaced with the daily grind of someone else's life. Despite all of this, there was no abolitionist movement. No one stood up to question the system en masse. It wasn't until much later, long after Greece's decline as a world power, that the ideas of freedom and universal rights began to emerge as widespread principles. For the Greeks, the concept of a slave-free society would have seemed as strange to them as the existence of democracy might have seemed to a king. Their moral and ethical framework simply didn't extend beyond the status quo they'd known for generations. While the world has come a long way in terms of human rights, ancient Greece remains a reminder of the complexities of historical legacies. It gave us ideas like democracy, philosophy, and art, but it also gave us a chilling example of how normalized cruelty can become when it serves economic and social structures. Slaves were the silent, invisible backbone of Greek society, their contributions both essential and unacknowledged. But even in the midst of all this hardship, ancient Greece wasn't defined solely by labor and struggle. People found ways to create beauty and meaning, often reaching for something higher than the harsh realities of their daily lives. For all its flaws, its inequalities, and its blind spots, ancient Greece remains a civilization that sought to bridge the gap between survival and significance. And as surprising as it sounds, some of that significance came from what they created when life was at its hardest. Imagine living in a world where every day was a fight for survival. Grinding physical labor, unreliable food supplies, and no guarantee you'd even make it through the year. And yet, even in this harsh reality, the ancient Greeks found ways to create meaning, seeking solace not just in the basics of survival, but in things far greater than the daily grind. They debated life's biggest questions, worshipped unpredictable gods, and wrote plays about love, war, revenge, and the absurdities of humanity. Their lives may have been chaotic, but they didn't just endure. They carved out something that still resonates thousands of years later. Philosophy became one of the most profound ways that ancient Greeks sought meaning in their existence. The bustling agora of Athens served not only as a marketplace, but as a forum where ideas clashed as loudly as the sounds of bartering merchants. Figures like Socrates wandered these public spaces, engaging anyone willing, or unlucky enough, to stop and listen. He wasn't there to give answers, but to unravel assumptions. Questions like, what is justice? Or, what does it mean to live a good life? Might seem lofty today, but for the Greeks, these inquiries weren't just intellectual exercises. They were deeply tied to the struggles of their everyday lives. Socrates' relentless questioning wasn't just philosophy. It was a challenge to face a world where certainty never existed. And then there were Plato and Aristotle. Plato didn't just wrestle with abstract ideas in solitude. He built the academy, where students gathered to hash out everything from ethics to mathematics, trying to understand not just the world around them, but their roles in it. Aristotle, meanwhile, dug into biology, politics, and the nature of reality itself, insisting that observation and reason were the keys to unlocking life's mysteries. Philosophy wasn't a luxury reserved for leisure hours. It became a lifeline, a structured way to cope with the unpredictability of human existence. It gave people a chance to reflect on their troubles and ask, why does the world work this way? Even if the answers often sparked more questions. But philosophy wasn't for everyone. For many, the chaos of life demanded more immediate emotional outlets, and that's where theatre came in. Greek theatre wasn't just entertainment. It was woven into the fabric of community and religion, mixing catharsis with social commentary in a way that no modern sitcom or film festival could ever replicate. Picture this. Thousands of Athenians cramming into stone amphitheatres carved into hillsides. Sunlight blazing down as masked actors strutted across the stage, portraying gods, kings, and ordinary fools caught in extraordinary situations. These all-day events weren't just pastimes. They were cultural and religious rituals, often part of festivals dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, festivities, and fittingly, drama. Tragedies pulled no punches. Themes of murder, betrayal, and war unfolded on stage, forcing the audience to confront just how precarious and cruel life could be. Plays like Sophocles' Oedipus Rex didn't offer happy endings. They ended with characters unraveling their lives through awful choices or sheer bad luck, as if to remind the audience that fate didn't pull any punches. It was raw, emotional, and probably more honest than most people wanted it to be. Then there were comedies, sharp, biting, and often downright ridiculous. Aristophanes, for example, wrote plays that teetered between clever satire and bawdy absurdity, poking fun at politicians, war, and even the gods themselves. Laughter, in that sense, became its own form of survival, providing a moment of release when every other aspect of life felt overwhelming. And while tragedy and comedy both had their place, the theatre's power came from its collective nature. The entire city came together to experience it. Rich, poor, citizen, and to some extent, slaves. Theatre wasn't watched in silence either. The audience engaged, sometimes loudly. They cheered, booed, hissed, and debated what they'd just seen. It wasn't merely escapism. It was a gathering space where the community could feel and process the chaos of their shared existence. Religion, too, filled a crucial role in giving meaning to ancient Greek life. While their gods were anything but predictable, often petty, vengeful, and prone to meddling, they still provided an essential framework for understanding the world. The Greeks didn't worship in the quiet, introspective way that some modern religions emphasize. Instead, their worship was loud, communal, and filled with grand gestures. Sacrifices, festivals, and rituals connected their daily grind to something greater. The belief in gods like Zeus, Athena, or Demeter offered explanations for everything from the cracks in the earth to the abundance, or lack, of crops. Take the Eleusinian Mysteries as an example. This religious ceremony, dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, offered hope for life after death, a comforting promise in a world where mortality loomed large. Participants, sworn to secrecy, went through elaborate rituals designed to inspire awe and perhaps give them a glimpse of serenity in the face of life's grim realities. The belief that the gods had a hand in human existence wasn't just a superstition, it was a survival instinct. When life felt precarious, faith became a way to impose order on chaos. This mix of intellectual exploration, communal experiences, and spiritual practices created a way for ancient Greeks to make sense of their difficult lives. Their cultural achievements stand in striking contrast to the challenges they faced. How does a civilization plagued by disease, war, and backbreaking labor find the energy to lift its gaze from the dirt and ask questions about beauty, truth, and justice? How did people who slept on hard mats with little to eat still find the will to carve marble, write poetry, or imagine what the heavens looked like? The Greeks didn't just survive hardship, they created civilization while sweating through it. Their philosophy wasn't indulgent, it was essential. Their theatre wasn't just distraction, it was an emotional outlet. Their religion wasn't blind worship, it was a lifeline, a way to understand a world without guarantees. None of these cultural triumphs erased the harshness of their everyday lives. But maybe that's what made them so vital. In finding meaning, they didn't soften reality. They dug deeper into it. It's easy to romanticize this era, to picture toga-clad citizens lounging at symposiums or grand temples glittering in the sunlight. But those images miss the work, the struggle, and the profound need that drove Greek achievements. They didn't just survive for survival's sake. They reached for something more, seeking to leave behind proof that even in the hardest times, humans can create something enduring. Drama, philosophy, faith, these were the tools they used to wrestle order out of chaos. They remind us that beauty and meaning are not privileges of the comfortable, but necessities of the struggling. So as you picture Greek marketplaces buzzing with debate, theatres roaring with laughter and tears, or temples standing tall against the sky, remember what they came out of. Every pillar of marble, every brilliant line of poetry, and every philosophical question sprang from a world where just getting through the day was a triumph. Their ability to create meaning and to insist on it remains one of the most powerful legacies of the ancient Greeks. And even as we marvel at what they left behind, it's impossible to ignore how precarious their lives truly were. For every philosopher debating in the agora, there were countless people sweeping, farming, building, unseen but essential. In their society's resilience lies a lesson for us all. Even in the bleakest conditions, people can rise to create something extraordinary, something lasting. Maybe that's the real gift the Greeks gave us. Not answers, but proof that humanity's best can emerge even in its darkest hours. The Greeks lived in a world that would push most of us to our limits. Homes without comfort, work without rest, and illness with little hope of recovery. Yet, from that grit came ideas, art, and systems that still shape our lives. They thrived in ways that defy the conditions they endured, reminding us of human resilience. As you lay in your comfortable bed tonight, remember how far we've come. Running water, medicine, a choice in how we live, all built on the sacrifices of those before us. If nothing else, the Greeks taught us this. Even in chaos, meaning is worth striving for.